They called him America's most dangerous inmate. For more than 3 decades, he lived in total isolation, no human contact, no sunlight, no freedom beyond the walls of a cell no bigger than a bathroom. His name was Thomas Silverstein, and his story would change the way America handles its most uncontrollable prisoners. To the guards, he was a nightmare. To fellow inmates, a legend. And to the prison system, a problem they could never quite solve. But before he became one of the most feared inmates in the history of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, Thomas Silverstein was just another kid growing up in a broken home in Long Beach, California. The making of a monster. Thomas Edward Silverstein was born on February 4, 1952. He didn't grow up violent. In fact, he was quiet, withdrawn, often misunderstood. But the environment around him was loud, chaotic, and rough. His parents divorced when he was young, and like many children from fractured homes, he began to drift. Silverstein struggled to find stability. By the time he was a teenager, he was already tangled in juvenile crime, petty theft, break-ins, minor trouble. But what made Silverstein different wasn't his crimes. It was his attitude toward control. He hated authority, teachers, police, and later, correctional officers. At 19, Silverstein was first sent to prison for armed robbery. He would later say that stepping into a California prison in the early 1970s was like entering another planet. Violence ruled. Racial gangs dominated. And if you didn't pick a side, you didn't survive. That's where Silverstein's transformation began. Inside, he aligned himself with the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang that controlled large parts of the prison system at the time. They promised protection and power in exchange for loyalty and violence. Silverstein proved to be both. By the late 1970s, Silverstein was already known among inmates as a man you didn't cross. He was transferred multiple times for fighting, intimidation, and suspected involvement in assaults, though many times, no direct evidence tied him to specific acts. Then, in 1980, his path crossed with USP Marion, the federal prison in Illinois that would become infamous because of him. Marion was designed to replace Alcatraz, America's new supermax for the most dangerous prisoners. It was here that Thomas Silverstein's name became legend. In 1981, Silverstein was accused of killing another inmate, a rival gang member named Danny Atwell. Silverstein denied the charge, claiming it was a setup by guards who wanted him gone. Still, he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. But this was only the beginning. Inside Marion, the tension between the Aryan Brotherhood and the D.C. Blacks, another powerful prison group, was constant and deadly. Each side blamed the other for attacks, and violence became routine. Silverstein found himself at the center of it. In 1983, he was accused, along with another inmate, Clayton Fountain, of killing Raymond Cadillac Smith, a leader of the D.C. Blacks. According to official reports, the murder was swift and brutal, carried out inside the most secure section of the prison. After that, prison officials labeled Silverstein a high-control risk. But it was what came next that made history. On October 22, 1983, something happened inside Marion that would shake the U.S. prison system to its core. That morning, Officer Merle Klutz, a veteran guard with 18 years of service, was supervising inmate movement inside the cell block. Silverstein had been restrained and escorted by Klutz many times. The two reportedly had a tense relationship. Silverstein later claimed that Klutz deliberately harassed him, moving his cell, tampering with his mail, and spreading rumors to provoke attacks. According to official records, while being escorted by Klutz and another officer, Silverstein broke free, grabbed a makeshift weapon, and fatally attacked the officer. The prison went into total lockdown. Moments later, another officer, Robert Hoffman, was also killed by a separate inmate, Clayton Fountain. Those two murders, within minutes of each other, changed everything. The Federal Bureau of Prisons responded with immediate and sweeping reforms. Marion, once a regular high-security facility, was converted into the first supermax prison in the United States, a prototype for extreme isolation. And Thomas Silverstein became the face of it. After the 1983 incident, the Bureau of Prisons decided there was only one place for Silverstein: complete isolation. He was transferred to a specially designed cell at ADX Florence, Colorado, the federal government's most secure prison, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. For 36 years, Silverstein lived in solitary confinement. No contact with other prisoners. No interaction with staff beyond food delivery. No physical touch for decades. This is the story of America's most isolated man. Thanks for watching. And if you found this story compelling, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating figures. His cell was small, about 7 by 12 feet, with a solid steel door, a concrete bed, and a small slot for food. He had access to books, writing materials, and occasionally, television, but no human presence. Human rights groups would later call his confinement psychological torture. Even former wardens admitted that keeping a man isolated for so long was unprecedented. Yet, despite the conditions, Silverstein adapted. He began drawing, painting, and writing letters to journalists and activists. He claimed that prison officials had created a monster myth around him, using his name to justify harsher isolation policies. "I'm not the animal they made me out to be," he wrote in one letter. "I'm just a man they locked away and forgot." Over the years, Thomas Silverstein became both infamous and mysterious. Some saw him as a symbol of prison cruelty, a man punished beyond reason. Others saw him as the embodiment of what happens when violence consumes a system from the inside. He was featured in documentaries, books, and academic studies about long-term solitary confinement. One former guard said, "He was calm, polite, even kind when you spoke to him, but you could still feel something underneath, like a storm waiting to happen." Researchers from the University of California documented the mental effects of extreme isolation using Silverstein's case. They found that prolonged sensory deprivation leads to hallucinations, anxiety, and cognitive decay. Silverstein himself described talking to the walls to stay sane. In interviews, former wardens admitted that Silverstein's confinement became a test case, not just for him, but for the system. How long could a person survive without meaningful human contact? The answer, in Silverstein's case, was more than 3 decades. Letters smuggled out of ADX Florence revealed Silverstein's evolving mindset. In the 1990s, he wrote frequently about guilt, regret, and the idea of transformation. He expressed remorse for the lives lost, though he always maintained that much of his reputation was built on exaggeration. "I've done bad things," he once wrote, "but I've also paid more than anyone ever should." Psychologists who studied him described a paradox: a man hardened by violence but softened by solitude. He meditated. He practiced art. He spoke about finding peace in silence. And yet, his name still terrified correctional staff across the country. Some officers refused to work near his cell. Others used his story during training as a warning. Never underestimate what an inmate can do if you let your guard down. The aftermath of Silverstein's actions reshaped federal prison policy. After the 1983 killings, USP Marion remained under permanent lockdown, 23 hours a day in cells, 1 hour for exercise alone. This model later inspired the creation of ADX Florence in 1994, designed to house inmates considered too dangerous for any other facility. Every major supermax facility built afterward carried traces of the Silverstein effect, extreme isolation as a form of control. But over time, even government officials began to question whether such isolation was humane or effective. Reports from Amnesty International, the ACLU, and even the United Nations Human Rights Committee criticized long-term solitary confinement as inhumane. Still, for Silverstein, there was no reversal, no parole, no chance of transfer. He remained in his concrete cell, a living ghost of a past the Bureau of Prisons couldn't erase. The end of an era. In May 2019, Thomas Silverstein died at age 67 at St. Anthony Hospital in Colorado. He had spent 42 years behind bars, 36 of them in solitary confinement, the longest any federal inmate had endured. Even in death, his story sparked debate. Was he the system's worst nightmare, or its greatest failure? His death marked the end of a chapter in U.S. prison history, but the questions he raised still haunt the justice system today. How far should a government go to control a man it deems uncontrollable? At what point does punishment become something else entirely? Thomas Silverstein's story isn't one of innocence. He took lives. He caused pain. He lived by a code built on violence. But his decades in isolation forced America to confront a different question, not about his crimes, but about our response to them. His legacy lives on not in the blood he spilled, but in the reforms and debates his name still triggers. When experts talk about supermax confinement, prison reform, or psychological endurance, Silverstein's case is the benchmark. Inside that concrete cell, one man became both a symbol of defiance and a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the prison system. Thomas Silverstein's life was a paradox. A man born into chaos, raised by violence, and consumed by the very system that tried to contain him. For decades, he lived alone in silence, a reminder that when prisons lose control, sometimes they create something even they can't undo. He may have died in 2019, but his story, and the questions it raises about punishment, isolation, and humanity, still echo through every concrete hallway of America's highest security prisons. For most people, solitude lasts minutes, maybe hours. For Thomas Silverstein, it lasted 36 years. 36 years without a hug, without shaking another person's hand, without seeing the sun rise or set over anything but concrete and steel. In the beginning, his isolation was punishment. But over time, it became something else, an experiment in endurance, psychology, and the limits of human sanity. This is what happened inside the box, the cell that held America's most dangerous inmate, and what his confinement revealed about the system that built it. The beginning of silence. After the 1983 killings at USP Marion, the Bureau of Prisons declared Silverstein a permanent threat to staff and inmates. Officials faced a problem. No facility in America was built to handle someone like him. He had already proved that even the most secure prison could fail to contain him. So, they made new rules, just for him. He was placed under what became known as a no human contact order. It wasn't symbolic. It was literal. He would be locked in a small concrete cell 23 to 24 hours a day, with zero interaction with any other inmate, and almost no face-to-face communication with guards. There was no yard, no cafeteria, no chapel. His exercise consisted of walking in a slightly larger concrete room alone, a box within a box. His meals were slid through a small slot. His showers were timed and monitored. Even medical visits happened behind glass. It was complete isolation, indefinite, total, and absolute. Designing a cell for a ghost. In 1987, engineers and prison officials designed a new type of confinement cell in Leavenworth Penitentiary to house Silverstein. It was meant to eliminate any possible human interaction. Every surface was reinforced: concrete floor, steel walls, plexiglass barriers. The lights were dim, the air recycled, and the temperature kept just above comfort level. He couldn't touch another person. He couldn't speak to another inmate. Even guards communicated with him through intercom or written notes. Psychologists would later call this level of isolation supermax sensory deprivation. The human brain, they said, isn't designed for it. At first, Silverstein resisted. He yelled through the walls, sang songs, banged on doors, anything to prove he was still there. But over time, the noise stopped. He began to withdraw. The mind begins to slip. By the early 1990s, Silverstein's letters to journalists and family began to change. The words were slower, softer, and more reflective. He described hearing things, phantom sounds, like footsteps that never arrived, or whispers through the vents. Psychiatrists say this is common among long-term isolated prisoners. The brain, deprived of sensory input, begins to create its own stimuli. Hallucinations become a form of company. In one letter, Silverstein wrote, "I've started talking to the ants that crawl under my door. They're the only living things that visit me." He named them, fed them crumbs, and when guards sealed the cracks to keep insects out, he said it felt like losing friends. In another letter, he compared his existence to living inside a coffin that someone forgot to bury. The world outside moves on. While Silverstein's world remained frozen, the outside world changed. By the late 1990s, the U.S. had built a new fortress for its most dangerous inmates, ADX Florence in Colorado. Nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX was the physical embodiment of the policies Silverstein's actions had inspired. It was designed to prevent another incident like Marion. Every inmate lived in near total isolation: steel doors, concrete walls, minimal human contact. When Silverstein arrived there in the 1990s, it was as if the world had caught up to him. The entire facility operated under the system he had forced into existence. But while other inmates eventually earned step-down privileges for good behavior, Silverstein never did. For him, there was no end date, no review, no chance of rejoining general population. He was the permanent prototype for total confinement. Over time, Silverstein developed rituals to survive. He meditated. He drew. He exercised in silence, counting each repetition out loud to mark the hours. He taught himself patience through art. His pencil sketches of prison life, barred windows, broken clocks, faceless figures, became haunting symbols of isolation. Some of his artwork was later featured in exhibitions about prison reform and human endurance. A journalist who corresponded with him for over 10 years described Silverstein's tone as calm and eerily disciplined. He had accepted the solitude, she said. It was like he'd become part of the concrete itself. Still, there were moments when the mask slipped. In one 2007 interview, he admitted, "Some days, I wonder if I'm still human." When you go that long without touch or conversation, it changes something inside you. As Silverstein's confinement drew public attention, so did the question, was this justice or cruelty? Civil rights organizations argued that his decades in solitary violated international human rights laws. In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture declared that any solitary confinement beyond 15 days could amount to cruel or inhumane treatment. Thomas Silverstein had endured over 13,000 days of it. The Bureau of Prisons defended its decision. They argued that Silverstein's past, especially the killings at Marion, made him an exception. He was too dangerous to risk even minimal contact. But the longer his isolation continued, the more public sentiment shifted. He had become less a threat and more a living experiment in what isolation does to the human soul. In his later years, Silverstein's correspondence revealed a man who had grown deeply introspective. He wrote about karma, forgiveness, and the mind's ability to adapt. He referred to himself as a man learning to live with ghosts. One of his final letters included this line, "I've made peace with the silence. It's the only thing they couldn't take away from me." He developed a strange relationship with the guards, distant, but not hostile. Some described him as courteous, even gentle. He no longer fought the system. He simply existed within it. Prison psychologists visiting ADX for studies often cited him as proof of human resilience, a person who had survived conditions that would break most. Thomas Silverstein's life reshaped U.S. prison design more than any policy ever could. Because of him, the Bureau of Prisons began experimenting with architectural and psychological control. Soundproof walls, motion sensors, remote doors, and restricted movement systems that became the blueprint for modern supermax facilities. His case was taught in correctional training academies. New officers learned his story not to sympathize, but as a warning that a single inmate could expose a system's weakness. But reformers saw something else, a system so afraid of losing control that it erased a man from existence to maintain order. When the ACLU released its report on long-term isolation in 2014, they cited Silverstein's confinement as an example of punishment without end. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about containment. By the time Silverstein entered his 60s, he had spent more time in solitary than most people spend awake in their entire lives. Physically, he began to deteriorate. His hair turned white, his eyesight faded, and his health declined due to lack of sunlight and movement. Still, he continued writing about art, meditation, and the value of staying calm in confinement. He once joked that he had become a Zen monk with a criminal record. In 2017, he was transferred to a medical facility after heart complications. He remained restrained, even during treatment. Those who met him described an unexpected humility. One guard said, "He never complained. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it wasn't about the past. It was about how quiet the world had become." On May 11, 2019, Thomas Silverstein passed away at St. Anthony Hospital in Denver, Colorado. He was 67 years old. He died the same way he had lived for nearly 4 decades, in custody, under guard, and silence. His death went mostly unnoticed in the media. No memorials, no statements from officials, just a quiet end to one of the most controversial figures in U.S. prison history. But for those who had followed his story, the reaction was complex. Some saw relief, that a violent man's story had finally ended. Others saw tragedy, that a human being had been buried alive by bureaucracy and time. His cell at ADX Florence was quickly reassigned, but his name remained etched into the system's memory. Even today, Prison staff refer to certain high-risk protocols as Silverstein-level security. Silverstein's story left a lasting mark far beyond the walls of any prison. His decades in solitary became a catalyst for reform discussions across America. In 2021, several states, including Colorado, the same state that held him, began restricting or banning long-term solitary confinement. Lawmakers, citing his case, argued that isolation beyond a few weeks served no rehabilitative purpose and often led to irreversible mental damage. To this day, human rights experts reference him when debating the ethics of indefinite isolation. Not because they excuse his crimes, but because his punishment forced the world to ask how far justice can go before it becomes something else entirely. Thomas Silverstein lived in silence longer than most people live in sound. He became the ghost of America's prison system, a man both feared and forgotten. His story is a warning that in the search for perfect control, we can lose sight of what it means to be human. As the lights in his concrete cell flickered for the last time, the debate didn't end. It just shifted. Was Thomas Silverstein truly America's craziest inmate? Or was he simply the product of a system that drove men to madness, then called them monsters for it? This is Crime Source. Subscribe for more.